Fresh water for the pastor, it says right there. Nice. Good morning.
Good morning.
It is good to be here. How many people are glad to be here? Well, most of you, that's good. Hopefully the rest of you by the time we're done this morning. Well, for those of you who are visiting, we've been doing a series on Joseph. Last week we took a little break and we had Pastor Dave Reimer here and was teaching us how to be a disciple, how to follow Christ, do what Jesus does. And so now that we are back here, we are on part number 7 of our series. So I told you when we started, I didn't know when this was going to end or where we would end up finishing off. So we'll probably be doing 2 more on Joseph, and then from there we'll transition into the Easter story, and you'll see how this will all fit together. So I don't want to disappoint you, but I'll be probably preaching for the next 5 Sundays, give or take. So that's good. Well, if you have your Bibles with you, if I get you to turn to the book of Genesis, we're going to be looking at Genesis chapter 41. We haven't got out of there yet, but we will. And our text will go all the way to 42, verse 9. I'm not going to read the whole text. You're welcome to read it when you're at home. We'll adjust as we go through this morning. We'll take a little portion here and a little portion there to get to our story. So the story of Joseph so far has proven to be this amazing story, a powerful story, really revealing to us how God's hand has been there the entire time throughout Joseph's journey. So step by step in his life, even in the setbacks, God has been there. God has been working behind the scenes. And so even when things were, we talked about some painful trials and some struggles that people go through, and even through the painful moments, the confusing moments for Joseph, God has been there. And so because we've had a little bit of a break and we've gone through, this is part number 7, I just want to do a little bit of a recap to set the stage for this morning. And we start with that recap when Joseph was 17 years old at his home. And that's when the dreams that God had given him began. Joseph started to dream. And Joseph began his life in his father Jacob's household with many brothers, and he was a favored son. And God gave him these prophetic dreams showing him one day that the family would bow before him. And that time, Joseph didn't fully understand these dreams, but they revealed God's plan for the future. In fact, we have learned that God actually called Joseph when he was 17 years old, and Joseph at that time didn't know it, he didn't understand it, but God had actually put a call on his life at a young age of 17. And then we brought ourselves to the pit, where God protects the promise that he was showing in the dreams. Joseph's brothers were jealous of him. They threw him into a pit. They sold him as a slave. And when what looked like betrayal, what looked like tragedy, was actually part of God's plan. Instead of being killed, Joseph was sold as a slave, and he headed to Egypt, moving him exactly where God needed him to be. And then we found Joseph in Potiphar's house. And it is in Potiphar's house that we actually get to start to see the character of Joseph being revealed. And in Egypt, Joseph faithfully served in the house of Potiphar. The scripture says that during that time of service, that the Lord was with Joseph. And because of God's favor on the life of Joseph, everything that Joseph seemed to touch prospered. And even when he was falsely accused in prison, Joseph's integrity, his faithfulness, his obedience to God remained strong. In fact, God started to refine him there. And it was there that we saw Joseph chose God instead of sin. Instead of fulfilling his the fleshly desires, he chose to serve God. And so God was shaping Joseph to be the man that he needed to be for this future leadership. And then fourthly, we found Joseph in prison, and that's kind of where we're at this morning. But while in prison, Joseph, 2 Sundays ago, interpreted dreams of Pharaoh's cupbearer, and a baker. And it was significant, or at least we see this as being very significant, because years earlier, Joseph had dreams that he didn't understand, he couldn't explain, he blurted them out willy-nilly without thinking twice. But now, God has given him this gift, this ability to interpret dreams. He has the gift of interpretation. And so he interprets for others. And even though he has been forgotten for 2 years, God has been waiting for the perfect timing. And so today we'll see Joseph in the palace. And this is where God reveals Joseph's calling. We see in Genesis 41. When Pharaoh had these troubling dreams that no one could interpret, the cupbearer, who Joseph had interpreted his dream earlier, remembers Joseph, and Joseph is brought out of prison, brought into the palace. And this is where God enabled him to interpret Pharaoh's dream and provide a plan, or a future plan, for the nation of Egypt during famine. So Joseph's journey is from his home to the pit, then to slavery, then to prison, and then to the palace. And it shows that God, and all these steps showed that God was involved, that God was actively working behind the scenes for Joseph, setting the stage for what is going to take place now. So in other words, what looked as setbacks, as sliding back, the 2 steps, or 1 step forward, 2 step back, those setbacks, there was a purpose. And those purposes of God, so God's sovereign, we talked about the sovereignty of God. God's purposes, God's plans, they cannot be stopped, they won't be stopped. And God's timing is always perfect. So let's take a look at our text, Genesis chapter 41. We're going to look at the first 14 verses, and we're going to, the point number 1 is going to be about God's timing. But before we do that, let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for this morning. Thank you for the sharing this morning, the sharing that was shared here. Mary's testimony of her victory, my mother-in-law's victory of, doctor said, the original words from the doctor was, it's definitely cancer. It looks like cancer, but it turns out it is not cancer. And so your timing is perfect, and we see it in the sharing, and we're going to see it this morning in the sermon. So thank you for that this morning, and we ask that you would just move us in a special way this morning, that we would learn something, that we could take the things that we go through in our lives and be able to apply it to every area of our life, and understand that God is working behind the scenes. And I know that I'm pushing this issue, and I'm emphasizing it a lot, because I think it is important as we live life, understanding that everything happens for a reason. And so I want to thank you for that this morning. Amen. Genesis chapter 41, the first 14 verses. It says, Now it happened at the end of the 2 full years that Pharaoh had a dream, and behold, he was standing by the Nile. And lo, from the Nile there came up 7 cows, sleek and fat, and they grazed in the marsh grass. Then behold, 7 other cows came up after them from the Nile. They were ugly and gaunt, and they stood up by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. Now the ugly cows and the gaunt cows ate up the 7 sleek and fat cows. And then Pharaoh awoke. And then he fell asleep and dreamed the second time. And behold, 7 ears of grain came up, and a single stalk, plump and good. Then behold, 7 ears, thin and scorched by the east wind, sprouted up after them. Then the thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump and full ears. Then Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. Now in the morning his spirit was troubled, so he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. And Pharaoh told him his dreams, but there was no one who could interpret them to Pharaoh. Then the chief cupbearer spoke to Pharaoh, saying, I would make mention today of my own offenses. Pharaoh was furious with his servants, and he put me in confinement in the house of the captain of the bodyguard, both me and the chief baker. And we had a dream on the same night, he and I, and each of us dreamed according to the interpretation of his own dream. Now a Hebrew youth was with us there, a servant of the captain of the bodyguard, and we related them to him. And he interpreted our dreams for us. To each one he interpreted according to his own dream, just as he interpreted to us. So it happened. He restored me in my office, but he hanged him. The baker was hung. So Pharaoh, in our story, in our text, Pharaoh has these two troubling dreams. One about 7 fat cows, and then 7 lean, ugly cows. And another dream about 7 healthy heads of grain and 7 thin heads of grain. And both dreams caused Pharaoh to be deeply troubled. And as Pharaoh is dreaming these dreams, Joseph sits in prison. Joseph had been in prison for 2 full years, 2 years, and no one remembered him. It was like he was forgotten. And the cupbearer in our text suddenly says he remembers, and he says, I remember my faults today. Verse 9 of our text. I remember my faults today. Oops, I forgot. I forgot about Joseph. I promised Joseph that I would remember him, but I forgot. So the cupbearer sits there as he's heard Pharaoh's dream, and he says, I know a guy. I know a guy. I can't interpret the dream. I can't help you, but I know a guy. I want you to think a little bit about that this morning. It's significant. It really speaks about God's timing. If Pharaoh had dreamed this dream a year earlier, or a day earlier, or a day later, Joseph might not have been called. The cupbearer may not even have been in the presence of Pharaoh when he shared the dream, but he was there. And the cupbearer remembered. God's timing is always perfect. It's not too early. It's not too late. God's timing in every aspect of our lives is perfect. And I know I have emphasized this a little bit, but it's important that we realize that God's timing is perfect. He's always on time. When we think we are waiting too long, we are not waiting long enough because God has a plan. And it reminded me of John chapter 11. We all know the story where Lazarus had died. One of Jesus' best friend, Lazarus, had died, and Jesus wasn't there. But when Jesus showed up on the scene 4 days later, Martha says to Jesus that you're too late, Lord. You've come too late. It's been 4 days. Lazarus stinks by now. There's nothing you can do. There's no miracle you could do, Jesus. You're too late. But it turned out in our story that God was right on time, because we know the story. God calls out to Lazarus. Lazarus, come forth, and Lazarus comes forth. Jesus was right on time. God is never late. His timing is always perfect. And so in our story today, at the exact right moment, not too soon, not too late, but at the right time, the cupbearer remembers God's call, and God calls Joseph. Joseph, he was in prison, he was forgotten, and then he was remembered at the exact right time. And Joseph's preparation in prison made him ready for Pharaoh. We talked about that 2 weeks ago, while God is working on the character of Joseph. And whatever it was that Joseph was going through, God was also working on Pharaoh and preparing for the famine, or preparing his heart, as we will see here shortly. And you and I might call it a delay, that God is too late, like Martha. You're just too late, Lord. But God is never too late. God hasn't forgotten. God calls. When God calls us having to wait, preparation. He is preparing us, preparing our character, preparing us for what is about to come, or maybe preparing somebody else so that at the right time, at the right moment, things will line up exactly how God has planned it. One of the wisest men actually, that ever lived, King Solomon. He says in Ecclesiastes 3 verse 1, he reminds us this, he says, there is a time for everything, there's a season for everything, every activity under the heaven. That means there there is always a plan. That means there is always a purpose, and God is orchestrating it for you and for me, as he did for Joseph. So if you're waiting this morning for something, maybe you're waiting to be healed, maybe you're waiting for a diagnosis from the doctor, whatever it is. Cancer has been a prevalent thing in our church. Every day we seem to be talking about it, but if you're waiting, there is a reason, there is a purpose, there is a time for it. But we need to ask ourselves a question this morning: how many of us are willing to trust God while we wait? Mary, you've been this perfect example. So impressed. What happens, happens. I'm leaving it up to God. And that's powerful. That testimony is powerful for all of us. Are you faithful while you're waiting? For the church, are you faithful as you wait for an answer from God? And does it make a difference to us knowing that God might have a purpose or a plan? We don't know what it is. Sometimes we get to find out in our lifetime. Sometimes we don't. Mary going to the hospital, there may be a purpose. And we don't know what the purpose is yet, but if you know that there's a purpose, maybe God is shaping Mary to do something amazing. Maybe there is something or someone that isn't quite ready yet, and that's why we have to wait. And that's what was happening to Joseph. That was what was happening in Joseph's life. Joseph's early dreams as a 17-year-old young man. Sheaves bowing down to his sheep. Stars bowing down to him. All those dreams that he had will soon make sense for us. What was once confusing is finally going to be revealed in Scripture for us. God had been preparing Joseph for exactly this moment in time. And maybe he's preparing you this morning for a moment like this, a moment where God will be able to use what is going through your life for his good, for his glory. Point number 2 this morning. From an interpreter to a leader. Joseph goes from an interpreter in prison to one who will lead. And when Joseph was brought before Pharaoh, we immediately noticed something about Joseph, and we talked about this 2 weeks ago, but we noticed his humility. He talks about God. He gives recognition to God. In Genesis 41, verse 16, it says, "It is not me. It is not me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer." What Joseph does here is he recognizes the source of his gift. He recognizes the source of his ability. He gives credit where credit is due. His ability to interpret comes from God. The question that we need to ask ourselves this morning is, do we recognize the source of our abilities, our gifts? Do we recognize the ability to preach? Is it to glorify God, or is it to glorify me? Your ability to play piano on that, your ability to sing. Do we recognize the source of our ability? And I think this is very important. God, the gifts that we get from God are God's gifts given to us. God's gifts gives us these gifts, and they're meant to serve others. They're meant to serve Him. They're meant for His glory. But far too often, we use them to glorify ourselves. Somebody says, "Man, that was a great sermon." Do I let it get to my head, or do I give God the glory? Do I go home and ask my wife, was it good? Did it make sense what I was saying? Is the focus on me, or is the focus on God? And it would have been easy for Joseph to take credit for himself. But he doesn't do that. He says, "It is not me." And I'd like to tell you that this morning when I preach here, it is not me. It is God who impresses upon me what I should say or what I should not say. And Joseph stands before Pharaoh and makes it very clear. This is the character. This is how God has been shaping Joseph. He says, "It is not me. It is God who will give Pharaoh the favorable answer." So Joseph interprets the dream. 7 years of abundance followed by 7 years of famine. And the message that Joseph gives, and I don't know if you can see this, I read this story so many times over the years, but it's really spoke to me. This message is a nation-changing message. This message that Joseph gives will disrupt the entire nation of Israel, will disrupt the entire region. And Pharaoh's response What is Pharaoh's response? Pharaoh, he appoints Joseph ruler over all of Egypt, second only to Pharaoh himself. In Genesis chapter 41 to the end of 44, it says this. Listen to this. Pharaoh said to Joseph, "See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt." Then Pharaoh took off his signet ring from his hand, put it on Joseph's hand, clothed him in garments of fine linen, and put a gold necklace around his neck. He had him ride in his second chariot, and then proclaimed before him, "Bow the knee." And he set him over all the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Though I am Pharaoh, yet without your permission, no one shall raise his hand or his foot in all the land of Egypt." Pharaoh hears a message that will disrupt the nation. It will force the nation to make these plans for 7 years of abundance and then 7 years of famine. They will have to build new buildings, new storage to store 7 years of surplus. As I read this, I was thinking about Noah and the ark. Noah is out there building an ark. People must think you are nuts. You're crazy. We haven't had rain for a long time. And here this nation, Joseph tells them that we're going to have to prepare for a famine. And Egypt must have had to change all their plans, whatever they had decided, whatever was known to the whole world. Think about that for a moment. We would call this a God moment or a divine moment. Pharaoh takes an interpretation from a Hebrew man, a young Hebrew man, an ex-con. He takes a message, an interpretation from an ex-con who was recently 2 years ago accused of attempted rape to Potiphar's wife, and he takes the words of Joseph and he believes it, no questions asked, every single word, and not only does he believe everything that Joseph says, he puts him in charge. Don't tell me that the hand of God hasn't been working here. We talked about this, that God had to prepare Pharaoh. Don't tell me that God hasn't prepared Pharaoh for that moment. Go tell Carney, go tell President Trump, this is what's going to happen, and see if they make all kinds of plans for you. They won't do it. This was a divine intervention of God. And I can't believe that it only took God 2 years to convince Pharaoh and get him to change his heart. And Pharaoh says, moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Though I am Pharaoh, yet without your permission, no one shall raise his hand or his foot in all of Egypt." Pharaoh believed every single word, and that kind of thing does not happen without the power of God. And the transition is actually staggering. 13 years for Joseph, approximately 13 years of setbacks. And in one single day, from a prisoner to an interpreter to a prime minister, second in command. God had a plan, God had a purpose for Joseph. James chapter 1 verses 2 to the end of 4 says, "Consider it all joy, my brethren." So if you're going through something this morning, consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. It will change you. It's about your character. Sometimes God uses our trials and tests our patience, our faith, our character, and when the timing is perfectly right, he uses it to fulfill his purposes. So what can we learn here? What can we apply to our own lives here? Well, when I read this and I read the story of Joseph, I am reminded that I should serve faithfully wherever I am, whatever I'm doing, whatever I'm going through. I need to serve faithfully because in due time, God will fulfill his purposes and his purposes will prevail. Another thing we can learn here is that we use our gifts that God has given us to glorify him and not glorify ourselves. And then finally, the big one, which is really important as we've been going through this series, is trust God's timing. God is never too late. His decisions are never wrong, no matter what you're going through. I know it's difficult for us not to want to question God's purposes and his motives, but God has his plans and God has timing, and his timing is perfect. Let's look at chapter 42 and read the first 9 verses, which is point number 3. The dreams, Joseph's dreams are fulfilled. Starting with verse 1. Now Jacob saw that there was grain in Egypt. And Jacob said to his sons, "Why are you staring at one another?" He said, "Behold, I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down there, buy some for us from that place, so that we may live and not die." And then the 10 brothers of Joseph went down to buy grain from Egypt. But Jacob did not send Joseph's brother Benjamin with his brothers, for he said, "I am afraid that harm may befall him." So the sons of Israel came to buy grain among those who were coming, for the famine was in the land of Canaan also. Now Joseph was the ruler over the land, and he was the one who sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. And when Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he disguised himself to them and spoke to them harshly. And he said to them, "Where have you come from?" And they said, "From the land of Canaan to buy food." But Joseph had recognized his brothers, and although they did not recognize him, Joseph, just like the cupbearer, Joseph remembered the dreams which he had about them, and said to them, "You are spies. You have come to look at the undefended parts of our land." So Joseph's brothers, they come to Egypt to buy grain. And what do? What is the first thing the text tells us? They bow down before him, fulfilling Joseph's earlier dreams. So here's Joseph, second in command, the prime minister over all of Egypt, and his brothers arrive bowing down before him and not knowing who he is. And I was thinking to myself, this must have been another moment of temptation for Joseph. Or at least it was a moment of testing for Joseph. He was second in command. He had all the power. Not only does he have all the power, but he also has what they need. He's in charge of all the food. He literally has the life and the death of his brothers in his hands. Brothers who hated him, brothers who sold him, who indirectly were responsible for his stint in prison. They're in front of him, and what is Joseph going to do? He starts speaking harshly, it says, and then he remembers his dream. It seems like a transition or a change takes place, and God reminds him of the dream. He disguises himself. And Joseph could have taken revenge. He had the power to punish him. He had the ability to lord this over him. He could have lorded his dreams over them. But he doesn't. The text says they didn't recognize him, but Joseph recognizes them. And notice the response. It says that he tests them before revealing himself. Joseph is revealing his character, the character that you and I have grown to appreciate in our series. He carefully testing them, showing the wisdom, showing the growth that Joseph has gained while going through these setbacks in his life. It shows his wisdom, his discernment. It is showing us that he is a man of God, a man that God has prepared all these long years. All these 13 years of difficulty for Joseph have literally revealed or fulfilled the very first verse we shared in our series, which was Romans 8:28, where it says, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him." He literally fulfills that verse. I don't know about you. Have you ever, Deb and I talked about this on the way up, have you ever been hurt by someone, but later you saw God use that situation to bless you or to bless someone else? We talked about some difficulties that we faced in a church that we previously went to, where we were hurt, falsely accused. It was very difficult for us. And it was hard to understand how God could use something like that for his glory. But interestingly enough, what happened there brought us here. We wouldn't be here in this church today if God hadn't used something that he get to use for his good, something in my life that brought about good, and so we are blessed to be here with you people. So your circumstance, your pain, your situation, I am reminded that it's not a permanent place. It doesn't last forever. Your cancer won't last forever. Your delay is not God's denial. It is not that God has forgotten you, like Joseph may have felt like that. And our trials, our testing, are not punishments for us, but they are actually preparation. And there's three things that we can learn here about our trials. And the first one is that God's promises, that we should be able to trust God's promises fully. They may take years. In Joseph's case, literally takes 13 years for God to fulfill his promise. Romans 8:28 says, and we know that in all things, and it's very important to understand the wording there. It says in all things, not in some things or a few things. It says, we know that in all things, whatever circumstance you're going through, whatever struggle you're going through, in all things, God works for the good of those who love him. Second thing we can learn here is that God can redeem our pain. Every betrayal, we see it in Joseph's life with his brothers, every hardship can be used for his glory, as we will clearly see. And another thing we will see is that reconciliation, forgiveness, restoration is all part of God's plan. And God will do that for Joseph and his brothers. And when we go through these trials and we go through these testings, those stories are powerful testimonies that we get to share with other people and explain to them how God brought us through this particular test. Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 and 6 says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him and he will, some versions say, direct your path. My translations will straight your paths. Gives me this picture of this is my life when I'm in control, and God seems to direct it. He straightens out our path. Joseph's story tells us or reminds us God's timing is perfect and that God's calling prepares us. Our calling in our life is prepared through the trials that we go through. Without the trials, we are not the people that God wants us to be. We need the trials. It changes us. It reveals our character. And once we reveal what kind of character we have, then we have something to work on. Another thing we can learn is that God's purposes, his sovereignty, is always fulfilled, and that even reconciliation, as we will see, is in his timing. It is always in the fullness of time. Galatians 4, verse 4. I'm going to use that as a benediction this morning, but always happens in the fullness of time. Point number 4. The tested. Joseph was the tested man, and now Joseph becomes the tester. Genesis 42 tells us that they didn't recognize Joseph, but he recognized them immediately. And immediately he tests them before he reveals himself to his brothers. He accuses them of being spies, and later we'll see he imprisons his brother Simeon to see if the others return with Benjamin. You might ask a question, why did he do this? Why does Joseph test his brothers? Why wouldn't he just say, hey, remember me? I'm your brother. But he tests them. Why would he do that? I think Joseph wants to know who his brothers are. I thought that maybe Joseph wants to see if his brothers are different than they used to be. Are they better than they used to be? Or are they worse than they used to be? Or are they the same? He wants to know who his brothers have become. God tested Joseph for 13 years before he put him in a leadership position. 13 years of testing. And now he will be doing the testing. He has grown to the point where he is now a leader and he is in charge, and he will do some testing. And Joseph's character is revealed in how he handles his brothers, how he deals with men who have severely wronged him. Joseph, we already know this of Joseph. I can't do it, but God can. I can't do it, God can. Joseph was about God's work, and we will see that Joseph is about grace. He is about the glory of God. Joseph is about forgiveness and reconciliation. Joseph reveals to us a Christ-like attribute. Last Sunday, Dave talked about this is what Jesus did, do what Jesus did. And Joseph is revealing exactly this Christ-like attribute, that he shows grace and forgiveness and reconciliation. 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 6 and 7 says this, "In this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while you may have suffered grief in all kinds of trials, so that the tested genuineness of your faith may result in praise, glory, honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ." Joseph was that man. He was about God's business. What are we? Who are we? Are we about God's business? Or are we about getting even? Imagine being put in a position of power like Joseph, where someone wronged you years ago, and then they walk into your place of business or to your home or your office, and you have this opportunity because you're all powerful, all controlling. How do you respond? How you respond will reveal your heart, just like it did for Joseph. Will you be vengeful? Will it be about pride, or will it be like Joseph and it'll be about wisdom, grace, and forgiveness? Joseph does exactly that. He shows wisdom in how he deals with his brothers. He exercises grace and how he responds, and he will also exercise forgiveness, as we will see. But it's important to be clear about this. Grace doesn't mean that you shouldn't verify who or what you're dealing with. Joseph does exactly that. He tests his brothers. Before he exercises this grace, he wants to reveal who these people are. How do we respond when God puts you in a position of authority over people who hurt you in your past? Do you use grace, or are you vengeful? Joseph chose to be gracious. And by testing his brothers, the testing, I was thinking, man, how difficult that must have been to be quiet. It's been 13 years since he's seen his brothers. These are the brothers that sold him into slavery, put him into prison. And he stands before his brother and he tests his brothers. It must have been very difficult for him to do that. It must have been difficult for his brothers who don't even know who he is yet. Joseph could have immediately revealed himself, but it's about the timing, and even in this case, God's perfect plan was restraint, and testing was also part of that. The brothers' characters are tested here as well, and we'll talk about it next week. They had to bring Benjamin back to Egypt to prove that they were telling the truth. And truth is what will be revealed. Truth is difficult, but that's exactly what will be revealed next week. Truth is coming for the brothers. Testing, so far in our series, has played this huge part. It's been a huge part of our series, this testing that followers of God have to go through. Testing that Joseph went through, and now his brothers are tested. I found a passage in Psalms chapter 101, verses 17 and 19, and it's really the story of Joseph and his testing. And it gives us a little bit of picture that prison wasn't just a walk in the park. It wasn't Club Med, where it was just house arrest. It sounds more difficult than that. But it does say this, and it talks about the testing. It says, "He sent a man before them, Joseph, who was sold as a slave. They afflicted his feet and fetters. He himself was laid in irons until the time that his word came to pass. The word of the Lord tested him." Joseph's suffering and imprisonment were God's way of preparing him to save the world as they knew it back then. It was to save the nation of Egypt. It was to save those in Canaan. In fact, next week in Genesis, we're going to look at Genesis chapter 45. But in Genesis 45, verse 5, we get to hear Joseph's own words after he reveals himself to his brothers, his own words to bring the point across that we're talking about this morning. In Genesis 45, verse 5, it says this. "You intended," he says this to his brothers, "you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, and that is saving the lives of others." The world intends to harm us. As Christians, the world intends to harm us, but God intends to use it for good. I'm going to close with this. Joseph teaches us that God develops character through our testing. That's the only way our character gets built. That's the only way we can be tested is through the trials and difficult things in our lives. Your trials are God's preparation for our character and for his purposes. Another thing we can learn from Joseph's story is that God redeems the past. What others intend for evil, God uses for good. And then thirdly, trust God. Trust his timing. Trust God's purposes. Your current struggles are temporary. Just like my struggles were temporary. I thought it was the end of the world, but my struggles were temporary. And they are for us this morning too. Whatever you're going through is temporary. And God's purposes are greater than our struggles and our pain. Proverbs 3 verse 5, chapter 3 verses 5 and 6. I'll close with this. It says, trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will, when somebody wants to direct your path, straighten your paths. Trust God even when you don't understand what you're going through. Let's pray. Father, thank you for the example that Joseph has given us. Thank you for an example of how you're working in the background, looking after things, and may we be reminded to trust you while we're waiting. So whatever struggles that anybody might be going through this morning, may we just apply it to our lives and realize that you have a purpose, you have a goal, and you will look after it in the fullness of time. Galatians 4 verse 4 says you sent your son in the fullness of time. Not a day late, not a day early, but at the exact moment that it was supposed to take place. And it's no different in our lives, Heavenly Father. Whatever we're going through, you will deal with it. It will come to an end. We will see the purpose. And if we don't see the purpose here on earth, we'll see it one day in glory. We'll understand why you did what you did. And so our response is that we are faithful while we are waiting, and we trust in